Today, we're going to get into the absolutely epic thousand-year story of Poland. And trust me, it's an incredible one. It's a story of resilience, a tale of a nation that was once a huge European power, then literally erased from the map, only to be reborn from the ashes, more than once. It's this powerful saga about a people who, no matter what was thrown at them, just never, ever lost their spirit. Okay, so here's how we're going to break down this incredible story. We're going to trace Poland's journey through 5 main chapters. We'll start with the forging of its kingdom, then move into its amazing golden age. After that, we'll see how it was shockingly wiped from existence, and then explore the relentless struggle for freedom that followed, all leading up to the modern nation that truly embodies this unbroken spirit. All right, let's start at the very beginning. Our story kicks off way back in the 10th century. Now, at the time, the area of modern-day Poland was home to a bunch of different Slavic tribes. But one of them, the Western Polans, whose name, by the way, means people living in open fields, they started to unify everyone. And that's what created the state that would last for centuries. So the Piast dynasty, these are the guys who really built the kingdom from the ground up. Let's just walk through the key moments here. It all really starts in 966. Duke Mieszko I's baptism. This wasn't just a religious thing. It was a brilliant political move. It brought Poland into the club of Christian Europe, which stopped its powerful neighbors from trying to invade and forcibly convert them. Smart, right? Then his son, Boleslav the Brave, goes one better and gets crowned the first official king. Now you can see the kingdom did fragment for a while, but it was eventually pulled back together by a guy with the fantastic name Władysław the Elbow High. So, as the Piast era winds down, a new one begins. And it doesn't start with a war, but with a marriage. You have Queen Jadwiga of Poland marrying the Grand Duke Jagala of Lithuania. This single union creates a massive Polish-Lithuanian state. I mean, it stretched all the way from the Baltic Sea down to the Black Sea. It was huge. And this really set the stage for Poland's golden age. So that royal marriage gives rise to the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which was, and I'm not exaggerating, a truly unique thing in European history. This was not your typical kingdom. It was something totally different. The whole system was built on this idea they called golden liberty. You can think of it as a kind of noble democracy. A huge part of the population, we're talking around 10%, were nobles or szlachta. And every single one of them was considered equal and had a real say in how the country was run. They literally elected the king and held most of the power in their parliament, the Sejm. And this comparison really shows you just how different Poland was. You know, all across the rest of Europe, you had kings and queens becoming absolute monarchs, grabbing all the power for themselves. Meanwhile, Poland was doing the exact opposite. The king was elected, and his power was seriously limited by the nobles. They even had this thing called the liberum veto, a rule where any single noble, just one, could stand up and block a law. It was an extreme form of liberty, but, as we'll see, it was also a fatal design flaw. And this era wasn't just about political freedom. It was also a beacon of religious tolerance. In 1573, the Warsaw Confederation officially guaranteed freedom of religion. This made the Commonwealth a safe haven, a place where people could flee from the absolutely brutal religious wars that were tearing the rest of Europe apart at the time. But you know, every golden age has to end. And that unique system, it had a fatal flaw. Those very liberties that define the Commonwealth, especially that liberum veto, they would end up being its undoing. The government became paralyzed, making it almost impossible to get anything done. It's a shocking question, isn't it? How does a major European power just vanish? Well, for Poland, it became a reality. The government was paralyzed because foreign powers figured out they could just bribe a single noble to use the liberum veto and dissolve the parliament. On top of that, decades of horrible wars, especially a Swedish invasion so bad they called it the Deluge, just ravaged the country, leaving the once mighty Commonwealth weak and totally vulnerable. So, Poland's ambitious neighbors, Russia, Prussia, and Austria, they saw their chance. In 3 separate moves they called partitions, they just carved up the country among themselves. There was this one last desperate attempt to save the nation, the Constitution of May 3rd, 1791, which was actually Europe's first modern constitution, but that just made their neighbors even more determined to shut them down. By 1795, it was all over. And just like that, for the next 123 years, there was no country called Poland on any map of Europe. The state was completely gone. But the nation, the idea of Poland, its culture, its language, its memory, that survived, but only in the hearts and minds of its people. But You can't kill an idea, right? The spirit of the nation absolutely refused to die. The entire 19th century became one long, relentless, and often heartbreaking struggle to get their country back on the map. So the Poles basically had two main strategies for survival. On one hand, you had the armed rebellions, incredibly brave but ultimately tragic uprisings against the massive armies of the empires that occupied them. But on the other hand, you had this really fascinating strategy called organic work. This was a non-violent approach. It was all about building the nation from the inside, creating secret schools to teach Polish, setting up businesses and cultural groups, basically keeping the national identity alive and strong while they waited for their chance. And then, after World War I, the impossible happened. All three of the empires that had partitioned Poland, they all collapsed. And in that power vacuum, Poland was almost miraculously reborn. On November 11th, 1918, a national hero named Józef Piłsudski declared the Second Polish Republic. But independence wasn't just handed to them. They immediately had to fight a brutal war against the Soviet Union just to secure their new borders. So, independence was finally won, but the greatest tests, the most difficult trials, were still to come. The 20th century would push Poland's resilience to its absolute breaking point. The scale of what happened next is just almost impossible to wrap your head around. In 1939, Poland was invaded by both Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, kicking off World War II. The occupation was horrifically brutal. 6 million Polish citizens were killed. That's nearly 1/5 of the entire pre-war population. And this number includes 3 million Polish Jews, who made up 90% of Polish Jewish community and were systematically murdered in the Holocaust. And yet, even in the face of that unimaginable terror, the Polish people refused to submit. They created something called the Polish underground state. It was a complete secret government with its own army, its own courts, its own schools, all operating right under the noses of the occupiers. Polish codebreakers were key to cracking the Nazis' Enigma code. Polish pilots became legendary heroes in the Battle of Britain. And a series of heroic, though tragic, uprisings in Warsaw showed a spirit of defiance that just could not be extinguished. Now, after the war, Poland wasn't truly free. It fell under the domination of the Soviet Union. But that fight for freedom just took on a new form. A huge moment came in 1978, when a Polish cardinal was elected Pope John Paul II, which gave the entire nation an incredible jolt of hope. That inspiration directly fueled the rise of Solidarity, an independent trade union that dared to challenge the communist government head-on. And this was no small protest movement. At its peak, Solidarity had 10 million members. 10 million! That's almost a third of the entire adult population of Poland. It became this massive, peaceful social force that, despite being crushed by martial law, survived underground and eventually forced the communists to the negotiating table. It sparked a wave of freedom that helped topple the Berlin Wall and end the Cold War. So, from its birth as a kingdom through a golden age of liberty to its complete erasure from the map and a triumphant yet tragic rebirth, Poland's history is just this powerful testament to an unbreakable national spirit. After 1,000 years of survival and struggle, the real question is, what comes next for this unbroken nation?